In the blazing heat of July 2025, on the outskirts of the quiet farming town of Bobo-Dioulasso in Burkina Faso, the ground began to shake. But this time, the vibrations were not caused by explosions, not by bulldozers, not even by military convoys. Instead, it was the sound of tractors, brand new, their red paint glistening under the sun, rolling across the dry fields in a long and determined line. There were dozens of them, moving forward with a steady rumble, cutting through the soil that for generations had carried both hunger and hope. But these machines were not gifts from foreign donors, not charity stamped with flags, and not another disguised loan wrapped in conditions. They were part of something far more radical, something that dared to question the very structure of global trade itself. There were no European brokers, no IMF contracts buried in legal jargon, no foreign consultants standing over the shoulders of farmers. What was taking place was raw and simple: cotton, soil, dignity, and a direct handshake. For once, the world looked the other way. Because the question lingered: why should nations in the global south still be expected to beg, to borrow, and to follow rules written in languages that were not their own? Why should their leaders be forced to speak with borrowed voices, to echo policies that never served their people? Under that same scorching sun, a farmer named Madu stood stunned. He had spent his entire life bent over rows of cotton plants, convinced that his children's future would look no different from his own past. But this time, something unusual happened. Young men from the Ministry of Agriculture approached him, not carrying demands or debt papers, but holding a folder written not in English, not in French, but in Moray, his own native tongue. His hands trembled as he received it. For the first time, the words of his government truly spoke to him in his own language. What you are about to hear is not just an economic story. It is about something much deeper: sovereignty. It is about the right of a people to shape their own destiny, to use their own tools, and to define their worth without asking for permission. This is the story of how President Ibrahim Traoré, a man whom many outsiders dismissed as impulsive or unpredictable, quietly rewrote over a century of dependency with nothing but the stroke of a pen and the roar of a tractor. If you've ever wondered whether real change can still happen in today's world, not in polished conference halls, not in loud headlines, but in dusty harvest fields, then stay with this story. Because what unfolded in the cotton lands of Burkina Faso may shape not only Africa's future, but also the future of every corner of the globe. And if you believe that trade should honor the hands that sow and reap, not just the hands that sign contracts in distant capitals, then this story belongs to you as well. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this incredible journey. The first chapter of this change began, not with cameras or political speeches, but with silence. A deal was struck without the usual parade of diplomats and without the staged photographs of Western leaders smiling for the press. Instead, there were just two flags waving softly in the wind, one red, green, and gold, the other green and red, and a field of cotton stretching far into the horizon. In July 2025, Burkina Faso and Bangladesh signed a groundbreaking bilateral agreement that bypassed the old channels of global trade. For the first time, African-grown cotton would move directly to the textile factories of South Asia without being funneled through European traders, without being subjected to exploitative pricing rules of international commodity markets, and without being packaged as aid. The simplicity of the deal was deceiving. On paper, it was straightforward. Bangladesh, one of the world's largest garment producers, agreed to buy high-quality Burkinabe cotton directly. This guaranteed Burkina Faso a long-term demand at fairer prices, but in return, something even more valuable was offered: access to technical expertise, modern farming equipment, training opportunities, and agricultural technology that had once been locked behind distant borders. Within the first year of this agreement, the results were undeniable. Over 400 tractors were delivered straight into the hands of farmer cooperatives. More than 68,000 tons of fertilizer reached the fields that had long suffered from depleted soil. Solar-powered irrigation systems began transforming regions once parched by drought. And perhaps most importantly, young agricultural experts from both nations started working together to tackle challenges that had haunted farmers for generations: how to control pests without poisoning the land, how to transport cotton quickly without it spoiling, and how to store harvests more effectively. Yet this agreement was never just about cotton. The collaboration sparked ideas that extended far beyond the crop itself. Educational scholarships were opened for Burkina Faso students to study in Dhaka. Vocational training programs linked the two countries' youth. Partnerships were built around disaster relief, post-harvest logistics, and even military peacekeeping exercises. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, life appeared calm on the surface. Diplomats in Brussels dismissed the agreement as a regional formality. Analysts in Washington smirked and called it symbolic. But in the villages, in the cooperatives, in the very fields where survival was once uncertain, people felt a quiet revolution was beginning. Because if cotton, the very symbol of exploitation and dependency, could now be traded with dignity, then what else might follow? President Ibrahim Traoré himself put it bluntly in a national address. "We are no longer exporting raw hope. We are exporting value, and we will never again sell our dignity for a lower tariff." For decades, Burkina Faso and other African nations had been trapped in the same cycle, exporting raw materials at rock-bottom prices, only to import finished goods at inflated costs. Their resources were stripped, their labor undervalued, and their economies tethered to loans and conditions dictated by outsiders. But with one signature, with one bold decision, that old narrative began to collapse. And though the powerful centers of the world tried to downplay it, farmers in Burkina Faso began whispering the same thought. If this is possible for cotton, what else can we take back? The morning skies over Kumbi, a small town in Burkina Faso's central plateau, were heavy with gray clouds. The horizon was painted with dust, the kind that carried both memory and warning. For years, villagers had a saying: "When the road disappears, the dreams disappear with it." And it was not just a saying, it was reality. In the rainy seasons, dirt roads would wash away entirely. Pregnant women in urgent need of medical care could not reach clinics in time. Farmers carrying onions or maize saw their crops rot before they could reach the market. Even ambulances, when they did arrive, often broke down or got trapped in the mud. For decades, this was the story of rural Burkina Faso, disconnected, neglected, and forced to depend on whatever scraps of development international donors decided to provide. But by mid-2025, something was different. The dirt was still there, the fields still dry, and the sky still unforgiving. But the work was being done by Burkinabe hands. Roads were being repaired, not by foreign contractors flown in with fat checks, but by local engineers who had been trained through a new national infrastructure program. This program was funded entirely by domestic revenue, not foreign loans. The equipment used to pave these roads was powered by the very sun that had long been the enemy of crops. Solar energy, once seen as a dream, was now a driving force. Women who had previously left their villages to clean houses abroad now worked as skilled technicians, operating heavy machinery and building the future of their country. One of them, Awa, described it simply: "I used to earn nothing and send everything home. Now I earn with my own two hands and build the home itself." The transformation was not just in roads. Agriculture itself was evolving. In April 2025, a $12 million tomato processing plant opened in the outskirts of Ouagadougou. For years, farmers had watched their tomatoes rot in the fields because they could not sell them before spoilage. Now, the harvest was being collected, processed, and packaged locally. Instead of importing tomato paste from Europe, Burkina Faso was exporting its own. For young men like Isaka, this change was personal. He had once dreamed of leaving for Marseille, imagining his life as a migrant laborer in Europe. Instead, he now led a cooperative of 15 farmers planting drought-resistant rice. He often said, "President Traoré gave us tools." But more than that, he gave us a reason to stay. What made all of this possible was not just money or equipment. It was a shift in philosophy, a rejection of dependency. For decades, African economies had been built on the assumption that they could only survive through aid, loans, and the export of raw goods. Burkina Faso was quietly breaking that assumption, but shifts of this magnitude never come without resistance. Beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, subtle warnings began to surface. International organizations adjusted their aid language, hinting at risks in the country's policies. Western analysts whispered that the nation was becoming unstable. Private investors grew hesitant, fearing they could no longer extract the same profits as before. Inside the country, however, the feeling was very different. Villagers who had once been invisible in the global economy suddenly felt that their work mattered. Farmers spoke of dignity in the same breath as they spoke of harvests. Students began seeing scholarships and vocational opportunities that did not require them to leave their homeland forever. Women saw themselves not as silent laborers, but as active builders of infrastructure and industry. It was a quiet revolution, not one led by guns or slogans, but by seeds, machines, and determination. And this quiet revolution was starting to inspire others. Neighboring countries began sending delegations to observe Burkina Faso's progress. Could cotton, tomatoes, rice, and solar-powered infrastructure really shift a nation's trajectory? Could a country long dismissed as poor set an example for the rest of Africa? The whispers of possibility were growing louder. What begins with cotton rarely stays in cotton. That truth was becoming more visible each day. History is not always rewritten in parliaments or palaces. More often, it is reshaped in the hands of ordinary people who decide they have had enough. That was happening now in Burkina Faso. But let us be honest, such a path is never easy. International pressure was already mounting. No armies were marching, but new forms of resistance were emerging. Red tape, delays in international cooperation, subtle campaigns to discredit the government. The old order was unsettled, because for the first time in a long time, an African country was saying, "We will trade directly. We will build independently. We will partner as equals." This idea that nations in Africa could trade without middlemen, create value within their borders, and negotiate on the basis of dignity rather than desperation, was deeply uncomfortable for those who had long written the rules of the global economy. So, while tractors plowed the fields and factories hummed in new rhythm, shadows of doubt gathered in the distance. Would this quiet rebellion be allowed to continue, or would it be strangled before it truly bloomed? For people like Madu, the farmer, who once received a government folder in his own language, these questions were not abstract. They were urgent. For the first time in his life, he believed that his children might inherit something more than debt and drought. But he also knew how fragile hope can be when the world decides you are not allowed to rise. The winds of change in Burkina Faso were not just felt in cotton fields or on dusty roads. They were echoing in conversations, in classrooms, in cooperative meetings, and even in evening gatherings under the stars. A sense of possibility, long absent from the hearts of ordinary people, was returning. In small villages across the Central Plateau, farmers who once depended entirely on uncertain rains now spoke of irrigation powered by solar pumps. For the first time, water was not only a prayer, but a resource managed with human hands. Where fields once lay barren during dry seasons, green shoots of maize, rice, and vegetables began to rise. Mothers who used to wonder if they could feed their children through the lean months now saw baskets filled with food lasting beyond the harvest. The pride was tangible. It wasn't about charity, and it wasn't about foreign aid stamped with donor logos. It was about ownership, about knowing that the sweat of one's labor stayed in one's own soil. This shift, though quiet, was revolutionary. Meanwhile, the partnership with Bangladesh continued to unfold in unexpected ways. While cotton remained the centerpiece, the cooperation spilled into new areas. Exchange programs brought Burkina Faso youth to Dhaka, where they learned not only about textile production, but also about how to run small industries efficiently. In return, Bangladeshi experts arrived in Burkina Faso, sharing knowledge about pest-resistant crops and community-based irrigation systems. A teacher in Ouagadougou explained it best. For years, our brightest minds had to leave to succeed. Now, they return with knowledge that builds here, not abroad. But outside Burkina Faso, this experiment was being watched carefully. Some African nations quietly admired the courage. Others hesitated, fearing the consequences of defying old trade structures. European officials, used to controlling the flow of raw African cotton into their markets, grew uneasy. Their carefully built system, one that relied on cheap African exports and European-controlled pricing order, was under threat. Yet in the countryside, this unease was invisible. Villagers did not measure success by foreign reports. They measured it in yields, in roads that stayed solid during the rains, in schools where children could learn in their own languages, in cooperatives where profits were shared instead of stolen. For decades, development had been presented as something delivered from outside. Now, Burkina Faso people were learning that real development is something you claim for yourself. But the stakes were high. With every step forward, the possibility of pushback grew stronger. International financial institutions began raising subtle alarms, hinting that Burkina Faso's economy could become unstable. Aid agencies adjusted their rhetoric, speaking less of partnership and more of risks. Western media, which had long ignored Burkina Faso, began publishing articles questioning whether the country was being reckless. To many Burkina Faso, these warnings sounded familiar. They had heard them before, every time a leader tried to step outside the narrow framework of dependency. But this time, something was different. The difference was tractors that moved across fields, solar pumps that pulled water from the ground, and roads paved not by outsiders, but by local engineers. The difference was factories producing goods stamped with "Made in Burkina Faso." The difference was farmers, women, and youth believing that their efforts mattered. One evening, in a small cooperative gathering, an elder spoke words that captured the moment. "We have been silent too long. For years, our cotton was taken, our gold was taken, our children were taken. Now, for the first time, we are the ones deciding how to use what we have." It was not a loud speech, not one meant for headlines, but the room grew silent. Everyone knew they were living through something their ancestors had prayed for but never seen. Still, not all was secure. Resistance from abroad began to appear not as armies or sanctions, but as delays, bureaucracy, and diplomatic pressure. Export routes were suddenly questioned. International buyers hesitated, hoping Burkina Faso would lower its prices again. Old allies became distant, but inside the country, the response was resilience. Farmers formed stronger cooperatives. Young engineers created networks to share innovations. Communities pooled resources to protect their gains. If the outside world was going to resist their independence, then the Burkina Faso would hold each other tighter. This was no longer just about cotton or even trade. It was about dignity. It was about proving that a nation long dismissed as powerless could stand upright and claim its future. Observers from across Africa began visiting. Delegates from Ghana, Mali, and Niger arrived to see the changes firsthand. Could Burkina Faso's model, direct trade, self-funded infrastructure, and local empowerment be replicated elsewhere? Could the threads of this quiet rebellion weave across the continent? International analysts often reduce history to policies, agreements, and summits. But history is rarely rewritten in conference rooms. It happens when farmers harvest more than survival, when children study without hunger, when women build machines instead of cleaning foreign homes. That is what was happening here. Yet the question lingered like a shadow over every success. How long would the world tolerate it? Could Burkina Faso's experiment grow into a sustainable model, or would external forces choke it before it could fully bloom? What began in cotton was now stretching into tomatoes, rice, roads, and education. But the possibilities went further. If Burkina Faso could build value around agriculture, could it do the same with gold, with lithium, with the very resources that powered the world's industries? If it could create dignity in farming, could it do the same in mining, in manufacturing, in energy? The future was uncertain, but the seed had been planted. And as every farmer in Burkina Faso knew, once a seed takes root, no amount of storms can erase the possibility of harvest. By late 2025, whispers of Burkina Faso's bold path were no longer confined to villages or cooperatives. They were being discussed in university lecture halls in Nairobi, in small cafes in Accra, and in political roundtables in Bamako. The story of tractors in cotton fields and solar pumps in dry lands had become a quiet spark of inspiration across the continent. But with every step forward, the resistance became more visible. International institutions, once indifferent, now began to take notice. Reports surfaced describing Burkina Faso as a risky environment for investors. Some European trade officials argued that direct agreements like the one with Bangladesh threatened the stability of global markets. Aid agencies revised their forecasts, warning of possible disruptions if the country continued to move outside established channels. Yet inside Burkina Faso, people refused to be discouraged. For them, these warnings were nothing new. For decades, they had been told what was impossible. They had been told that they were too small to negotiate, too poor to build, too weak to stand without the backing of loans. Now, seeing roads paved by their own engineers, machines driven by their own women, and factories run by their own youth, they no longer believed those voices. In a gathering with local farmers, President Ibrahim Traoré said words that spread. Far beyond the cotton fields, trade is not trade unless it respects the humanity of those who grow the harvest. We will not bow to fear. We will not sell our dignity for convenience. Burkina Faso will stand tall, even if we must stand alone. These words were repeated again and again across villages and towns. They were written on walls, sung in songs, and whispered in conversations, not because they were dramatic, but because they captured a truth that people had always felt but rarely heard from their leaders. And while diplomats in Washington and Brussels dismissed the agreement as symbolic, the impact on ordinary lives was undeniable. In just 1 year, hundreds of tractors plowed land that had been abandoned for generations. Thousands of farmers gained access to fertilizer and tools that multiplied their harvests. Solar-powered irrigation brought new hope to regions long cursed by drought. A generation of youth, once desperate to migrate, now found reasons to stay. The rebellion was not fought with weapons, but with dignity, and that made it harder to suppress. Still, the pressure was real. Subtle diplomatic messages arrived, warning of consequences. Some aid programs slowed their disbursements. Foreign companies threatened to pull out. But in Ouagadougou, the government stayed firm. The strategy was not about rejecting the world. It was about renegotiating their place in it, not as beggars, not as dependents, but as equal partners. And slowly, new alliances began to form. Conversations opened with other nations in Africa, Asia, and even Latin America. The idea was spreading. Trade could be horizontal, not vertical, mutual, not exploitative. A farmer in Burkina Faso could deal directly with a factory worker in Bangladesh. A cooperative in Ouagadougou could collaborate with a community in Kerala or Sao Paulo. The old order found this unsettling, but for ordinary people, it felt like justice. In the heart of Kumbi, Madhu, the farmer who once received a government folder in his own language, now looked at his children differently. He no longer saw them as future migrants, destined to leave for survival. He saw them as future builders of their own land. His eldest son, once eager to cross the Mediterranean, now worked with a cooperative experimenting with organic fertilizers. His daughter studied agriculture with hopes of becoming an engineer. This was the silent revolution. Not riots in the streets, not armies on the march, but families quietly realizing they had reasons to believe in tomorrow. But outside the country, the narrative was shifting. Some Western commentators described Traoré as reckless. Others suggested he was isolating Burkina Faso. Yet beneath these criticisms was a deeper fear, that the example of Burkina Faso might spread. If cotton could be traded with dignity, why not cocoa from Ghana? Why not lithium from Mali? Why not gold from the Congo? What began in cotton was beginning to ripple outward, and that was exactly what worried the old powers. Because once a nation learns to feed itself, to build its own infrastructure, to educate its youth, and to trade on its own terms, it becomes harder to manipulate and impossible to ignore. Burkina Faso's journey was not about perfection. Challenges remained: poverty, climate risks, external pressures. But for the first time, the country had chosen a different road, and that choice mattered more than anything. History may one day remember 2025 not as the year of a single trade agreement, but as the year a small nation in West Africa dared to break a cycle that had lasted for generations. The tractors in the fields, the solar pumps in the ground, the cooperatives in the villages, these were not just symbols of change. They were the beginnings of a new fabric being woven, one thread at a time. And so, the question is no longer whether Africa can rise. The question is whether the world will loosen its grip long enough to listen. If you believe this story matters, not just for Burkina Faso, but for what it reveals about sovereignty, justice, and the courage to dream differently, then carry it forward, share it, talk about it. Let it reach beyond these words. Because in the end, stories are seeds, and like seeds, they grow when planted in the minds of those willing to believe. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, make sure you subscribe and join us on this journey.